morning, good afternoon. Thank you for coming back. I'm bringing you something else that I've been thinking about for a while because I'm realizing that I ponder things to myself and sometimes I never say them out loud or I just talk to them with my friends, but I'm still making notes about them or I might even talk about them on my Instagram stories. And this is something I have talked about before and I want to bring it here because I do believe that given everything that's going on in the world, and even before we got to this point, I think a lot of people are deconstructing their understanding and relationship with Christianity. And what I want to talk about today is how the God that you're serving may not be the God that you think you're serving. And I say that because what if people don't actually struggle with the concept of God or the religion? They struggle with the version of God that they've been taught. And I say that because oftentimes when there is something happening in the world, people are like, oh, we need to pray, or, you know, karma will come and get you, or God don't play about me, or all these other things, right? And they're often reminded by others that this is the same God who sat and watched slavery. This is the same God who sat and watched these genocides or all these atrocities in the world, as if to say they don't believe, which I'm not here to convert anybody to a believer or a non believer. That's not my role. My role is to make you think, right? But these are legitimate questions. These are valid questions that we should be asking. And in fact, sometimes when you ask questions of people who are religious leaders, they admonish you for asking. And that alone should tell you enough right there that something isn't right. Not to say that somebody should have all the answers or anything, but it is to say that lack of answers, lack of understanding is questionable. So, sometimes we treat our interpretation of God as the end all be all. Like we think that the biblical God and our interpretation of God is the same thing. And that's often why people who are not spiritual cannot understand why those of us who are can still separate ourselves from religion or separate ourselves from the church and still believe in a higher power. And I think that's how, because we have learned how to separate God from the God that we were taught, right? And it's almost like a understanding that there is divinity out there, but it's not in this organized religion. So I think that not only are people struggling with their Christianity because of that, but also because the God that you've been taught actually wasn't God all along. It was King James. And I say that because, most of us were brought up under the King James version of the Bible. And a lot of people don't know who King James is. And I think it would behoove a lot of people if they would go look into it, who he is, his prominent milestones within his reign as a king, um, things that matter to him, things that he did. I think it's worth looking into. And if you do that, because I'm not going to tell you, if you do that, I think you will begin to look at this biblical thing very differently. So, of course, the King James, who commissioned the Bible in the early 1600s, before he got his hands on it, it was 88 books in it, right? And once they finished it for him, he only had about 63. I want to say is how many are in the Bible now. Which tells us what? There was a lot that was taken out of it. There's a lot that's missing. There's a full story that's not being told. That's number one. Think about the timeline in which that happened. It just so happened to start in the 1600s, early 1600s. What was happening at that same time? Right, you guessed it. So, yes, the Bible was translated, but even before it got to King James, for the sake of translating and communicating, everyone didn't have access to the Bible because everybody couldn't read, which left you subject to other people's interpretation. Um, and if you're subjected to somebody else's interpretation because you are of a community, or I guess the commoner people, village people weren't capable of reading, what does that mean? They can change it over time if they wanted to fit a certain narrative. So, like, The Bible, plain and simple, was shaped by politics because the king is who commissioned it. That's like akin to a president. It was shaped by politics. It was shaped by culture at the time. Obviously, because some of the what's the word? Some of the laws in the land obviously reflect that. And then it was also shaped by power structures at the time. Now we don't have kings and queens anymore, or at least not in the U.S. I don't know how Parliament works across the pond, but obviously I believe they still function like how we have presidents and Congress here. Either way, um, when you think about it from that aspect, and you look into who King James is, and you consider what was happening around that time, and you consider how culture was around that time, you will begin to understand that what you have been taught may have been a lie, but you believed it. Why? Because you've been indoctrinated. Because nobody's born a believer. Sorry, I I hate to break it to you, but we know stories of children who are born into families who may not be a part of the church, never step foot in the church, don't know anything about God or anything like that, right? But somehow they become a believer, excuse me, because they were introduced to God in some other way. That alone lets you know that people were not born believers. People are born and then they're indoctrinated. We do christening for people. We do vacation Bible school. Do they still do that? I don't know if they still do that, but we do vacation Bible school. Um, we have children's church and children's choir. We have all these things teaching you from a very young age that this thing is real. This person is real, and that these principles and these expectations and these stories are real. And I've always said for a very long time that I don't really take it seriously. I take it as parables, things to learn from, things to consider. But I've always been interested in having my own relationship. And I went through my whole phase because I'm a fourth generation church lady. Okay, by the way, fourth generation church lady. I'm definitely a believer in Christ for sure, but um, this whole concept of God is what I question. And it's like when you are used to when something is like put into you at an early age, of course you're not going to deviate from that. That is all you know. You think it is true. There are people who think that things that in the Bible are true because it's in the Bible, disregarding the fact that it has so many authors, disregarding the fact that there were so many versions before the King James version, disregarding the fact that the Bible as we know it now is not the original Bible, disregarding the fact that, like I said earlier, this Bible before it got to King James was reduced down to 63 books. I want to say 63. I should probably look that up, but that's not the point. Okay, that's not the main idea. Stick to the main idea. We're not worried about semantics. Having said that, when you read the Bible, and that's another thing, people don't be reading for themselves. My mother, devout. Mother, grandmother, great grandmother, devout. Okay, they were about reading that Bible. They knew their Bible. I know the Bible, right? When you read it, you can't help but wonder or feel like God is human like. And I think that is by design. I think it's meant to feel human like so you can adhere to it. But two, because it was an authoritative tool. It was an authoritative tool. And when you think about the time frame in which this was commissioned, it seems as if this was just another tool to support or discourage people from questioning or challenging authority, right? So, like I said, it feels very human-like, which makes it more personable. It feels a bit personable, and God is often characterized by jealousy, by authority, by punishing, by ego, all these different things. But then, on the flip side, we look at Jesus, empathetic, service leader, um, a friend to many, not judge, not he didn't judge, polar opposites, right? And at first, I had this thought. Maybe last summer, I was thinking like maybe God is egoic and recognized the mistake he did made with Adam and Eve, so that he brought Jesus, and Jesus was the redeemer and was his chance to better. What's the word? How do I want to explain? How did I explain it before? Basically, there was this authority, there was this punishing behavior, there was this jealousy, this egoic God who recognized that that wasn't effective. So he had to create his son to go out and kind of refine his principles and refine what he wanted for his people. That's what I was thinking before. I thought that last summer, right? And I was thinking that, they kind of they push the same things. They are for some of the same things, but Jesus is a bit more diplomatic about it. That's the end all be all of that. I can't remember everything I said then, but that's really what I was saying then. And it makes you wonder, if this is supposed to be your only begotten son, why is it so different? Why is it so different? And then why are we then in turn as believers expected to be like Jesus if Jesus wasn't even like you? And it's a lot of Christians in general. That's my problem with Christians overall. Like, if you were more like Jesus, you wouldn't have all these isms going on in the first place. There wouldn't be all this hate. It would be more compassion. It would be more empathy. It would be more uniting. Nonetheless, yeah, there's a dichotomy right there going on. So I'm not saying that God isn't real. I'm never going to say that. But I am. It is starting to feel like a Wizard of Oz. It's feeling like the Wizard of Oz. And it's feeling like the God that we've been taught is not the God who actually exists. Because, okay, the word is omnipotent or omnipotent. I'm going to go with omnipotent though. That's how um the computer said it. That's how I'm going to say it. Nonetheless, there's so many different other, what's the word, contradictions overall in the Bible, but that's just one of the main ones. Like, we can't say that God is omnipotent and God is all things and all in all, and we have all these names, and then say that we shouldn't question, we shouldn't challenge. I'm sorry, but the God that I believe in is bigger than that, and it's nothing for a big dog. Okay, um, so having said that, I would challenge people to consider what you have been taught versus what you believe versus what you've actually experienced. Because, like I said, um, it goes against the human design. It goes against human nature, and it tries to put you into this box and behave a certain way and be a certain way. Although Jesus was the complete opposite. I don't know why they left that in there. It like, I think that, I don't know. I don't know. I, I'm starting to feel like they use that man as a lesson for the rest of us. What will happen if you try to do the right thing? Either way, if you think about all of that, if the God in the King James Version is the God who is, wouldn't they be graceful, compassionate, understanding, empathetic, open, like, not just fearful or creating fear, authoritative, punishing? Like, it just doesn't add up to me. And I just finished reading this book called When God Was a Woman by Merlin Stone. I highly recommend that reading because it makes you sit with yourself and things you've been taught. I kind of want to go over it again with the Bible. She did quote some Bible scriptures and whatnot, but the English major in me is like, let's explore this a little bit more. I want to follow up on this and see about this because this feels a bit more credible when you think about the creation of Earth. This feels a bit more credible when we think about what's the word? How men and women operate. It just seems a bit more credible to me. So, having said all that, a lot of people haven't walked away from God. Okay, they not. A lot of people ain't walked away from God. That's a word for somebody. Okay, I may have left the church, but I ain't left the Lord. Amen. Some people walk away from the version of God that they were taught. And that's not to say that God is supposed to stroke your ego, it's supposed to make you feel good, because it doesn't. It doesn't. When you have your own relationship absent of religion, you don't need anybody else to shame you. You will feel the shame yourself. You will feel the regret yourself. You will begin to reflect yourself. And it's not that shame induced or guilty conscience that's given to you saying that you're doing something wrong. No, it is your own conviction. It is I know better and I didn't do better. It is I learned this lesson a long time ago and I shouldn't be doing this anymore. It is not some external force claiming to be an authority and lording over you, right? So like that's just something I've been thinking about it. It's been at least 10 months or so. I've been thinking about that. Um, because another thing that we don't like, there's always this conversation about Christianity versus witchcraft. I think it's the same thing, me personally, right? When you understand symbolism, when you understand intention, manifesting versus praying, we're all doing the same stuff. I'm sorry, right? Obviously, there are people who do things with or for evil entities and whatnot, but with the God that is in that Bible, that God is evil too. That's the crazy part. That God is evil too. That God is vindictive as well. And it brings me back to, is the God you serve even the God that you were taught from the Bible? I don't know. It's something. It's just something to think about. It's something to think about. Um, but I brought up the witchcraft point because King James was obsessed, player hating, copying witches. And when you think about the lady Merlin Stone, she didn't bring this up in the book, but think about who's still called witches today. Wise women. Think about who used witchcraft, oppressed people. And that man wrote books about it. He studied it, and I am willing to believe that he copied it as well. He bit off some stuff. He remixed some things, right? And that's why we see a lot of similarities. Those of us who are on the in between, I guess, or those of us who've been on the Christian side and you've gone to the witchcraft side, I guess, you can see the similarities. You can see that there are not many distinctions between the two, or anything. There's not anything distinguishing them. But if you've only known this thing and it told you that everything else is bad, how will you truly know? Like, you can't rely on indoctrination alone. You can't rely on what you've been taught alone. You have to go and explore for yourself. You have to think critically first and then go explore for yourself and form your own answers. And a lot of people are just not capable of doing it. But for those of us who are, I beg you to ask yourself, what is the difference between what I believe, what I've been taught, and what I've actually experienced? And do you see or do you recognize any patterns or similarities between the things you find? So I don't have any skin in the game. It makes me no difference what you decide to do. Like I said, I'm not trying to capture or save any souls. I'm not trying to lead anybody to Christ or to God. I'm not trying to take you away. I'm only trying to make you think. And I think that through thinking and through seeking understanding, I think you'll have a closer relationship. That's just me personally. I do think that church functions for a specific thing. Oh, here. Church functions for in a specific way for a specific thing. One, community support, like mindedness, a sense of belonging, but also it can be a very harmful space. It has been a very harmful space. And under the guise of religion, we have condoned a lot of unfortunate things. So, yeah, that was just something that was on my mind today. I'm like, maybe the God that we're taught about isn't God at all. And that's why people still have misfortune. That's why people are still lost. That's why people are still suffering, because the God that you're praying to was a king.